And of course, the question of the hour is, and has been for a number of weeks now, what exactly is driving the ascendancy of Donald Trump on the Republican side? A lot of us have strong ideas why that might be, a combination of fear, bigotry, and so on, intersecting in the worst possible way, but in a sadly predictable way. A new poll suggests that our intuition, our collective intuition as a nation, or certainly as a progressive movement, is probably right. There is a new poll from the Washington Post and ABC News, which asked a number of questions, or newly published, I should say, asked the questions earlier this month of Trump supporters, trying to get an understanding of what was driving them. Now, what they say is that there are two separate forces driving support for Donald Trump. One is economic anxiety. The second is racial anxiety. And by racial anxiety, they are too polite to say so in the in the Washington Post, excuse me, but they are too polite to say so, but they mean white racial anxiety. Now, let's look a little bit more at the demographics and the information about Trump supporters. They disproportionately lack any college education. Now, that's important because we now know, we've had Susan Case, the economist, on this show. We now know that white people with only a high school education have disproportionately suffered economically in recent decades. Obviously, people of color have done worse, but their world has kind of been collapsing out from under them, which is a situation that often creates both panic, fear, and hatred. It is that demographic that suffered badly and that has been struck by what the economist Susan Case calls the deaths of despair, enormously rising amounts of alcoholism, drug overdose, and suicide. So they are frightened, they are in despair, they are anxious, they are looking for someone to blame. Donald Trump comes along and gives them someone to blame. He gives them immigrants to blame. He gives them minority religious groups to blame. He gives them different ethnic groups to blame. In other words, this poll is telling us that we are in a situation, as we suspected and feared, where we see many of the preconditions for an absolutely totalitarian hate movement to arise. Now, that is my conclusion. That, of course, is not what the Washington Post or ABC News says, but they do say people were asked whether they thought it was more of a problem that African Americans and Latinos are losing out because of preference for whites, or whether whites are, quote, losing out because of preference for blacks and Hispanics. Now, unsurprisingly, Trump did particularly well with those who are saying they are struggling economically, and even better with those who say that white people, as opposed to people of color, are getting the short end of the stick. So both economic trouble and the feeling that white people are getting the shaft has, according to the study, a separate but enormous impact on the level of Trump's support. In fact, people who were concerned about what the Post calls white status appear even more likely to support Donald Trump than those who said they were struggling economically. In other words, there are people out there, white people, who feel cheated and they don't know by whom. If they are not told the truth about what has happened to this country, about the arising of an oligarchy, about the wealth shift to the 1%, they are going to turn their unnamed fears and hatreds and their awareness of their dwindling way of life, and they are going to turn it against those who are not only not to blame, but those who have been suffering all along. That, my friends, would be a national tragedy. It is something we need to prevent by telling people the truth.